I'm Mike Wheeler. Welcome to another episode of Democratic Dialogue. Our guest today is Billy Jackson, who's here to tell us about ranked choice voting. And I'll confess, I know a bit about it, but I know that in 28 minutes I'm going to know more. Billy, you were kind enough to come to one of our monthly meetings very recently, and you asked how many people knew about ranked choice meeting. There might have been 50 people in the room. I think it was a majority or close to it.
I think it was about 75% of the room, which is incredible because 3 years ago when I used to ask that question to rooms or people, it was like 1% of a room.
Well, that's obviously an upward trend, and obviously it's, our group is interested in politics. But not only did 75% know it, but I think virtually all of them were in favor of it, which is a good thing too. We'll see if we can make the case for it in the time that we have. I want to start with a rant, though. I warned you of this, and I want you to talk me down from the ledge. I was looking at some numbers. 2016 election, popular vote. Hillary Clinton got 65 million plus. Donald Trump got 62. 92 million people who were eligible to vote did not do that. And it's hard for me to see how we can sustain and have confidence in democracy if people don't vote. I understand it's not that ranked choice voting is going to solve all of that, but it might in some ways make progress. Part of it is states that only vote on Tuesdays and people have to work or are traveling. Part of it is voter suppression in some instances. Part of it, though, I think is, it saddens me to say this, but people have given up on democracy. And tell me not to be sad about that.
Well, first of all, I think you're right. A lot of voters feel disenfranchised. A lot of people feel like their vote doesn't count. I hear that all the time, and I don't think there's one fix that's going to fix all the problems in our electoral system, but I do think that one thing that as I talk to voters, I hear them say is they feel like their vote doesn't matter. They feel like they don't have enough choice in the ballots. And that is one thing that ranked choice voting can help with. It can increase the range of choice on the ballots. Right now, go ahead.
I was going to say, as we go through this, you'll give us some examples. Fingers crossed on both hands here. I hope we'll have some visuals to go with it at a certain point, but if we can also explain it more clearly in words, if those don't come through, we'll still be able to make the presentation. I cut you off here, but ranked choice voting is...
explain it?
Yeah.
Sure. So let me give you a little bit of an example first about what I was saying about the range of choice on a ballot. Right now, oftentimes we feel like we're limited to a choice between two candidates on the ballot. And a lot of times, even if we like a third candidate, we feel compelled not to vote for that candidate, and we feel compelled that we have to vote for the lesser of two evils, right? We hear people say that all the time. And there's the reason for that is the way our electoral system works, right? If you and I are running against each other in a race, right, and we're pretty close, let's say I even have 55% of the vote and you have 45% of the vote, right? If another person enters the race who is similar to me, what we're going to end up doing is splitting the vote of that voting base. That candidate is going to take some of my votes away, which is going to end up getting you elected.
Well, at first blush, that's okay with me. But it isn't okay in a general sense.
What it does is it discourages other candidates from getting in the race, and which reduces the amount of voices and amount of ideas we get in elections.
I think there's an equally important problem with it. So I get elected, lucky me, because your vote was split. But it means that 55% of the people who voted were disappointed.
Exactly.
And are stuck with me. And that's bad because it detracts from the legitimacy not only of me personally, but of elections and of governance. So that may well be a factor in people's disenfranchisement, disenchantment too.
That's true.
With the process.
That's true. So you wanted me to tell a little about how ranked choice voting works?
Sure.
So currently in our current voting system, you vote for one candidate, right? You have a list of candidates on a ballot and you just pick one, right? So under ranked choice voting is we basically widen the ballot. Okay? Every voter still gets to choose who their first choice is, and you also get to indicate a series of backup choices in the event that your first choice is eliminated and not the winner.
And how do we get eliminated under that system? So if there, I mean, we want to take a relatively small number, but what would you give us as an example?
Sure. So I could give you a little example right off the cuff. Let's say you have 3 candidates in a race. Let's call them A, B, and C. Okay. If candidate A has 48% of the vote, candidate B has 47% of the vote, and candidate C has 5% of the vote, under our current system, candidate A is elected the winner, right, with the most votes. Under ranked choice voting, what you do is you need to ensure that a candidate wins with a majority of support, which means over 50%. So under ranked choice voting, you look at all the first choices of all the voters, and you still see 48, 47, and 5%. And since no candidate has a majority, what happens is what's called an instant runoff kicks in, which we take a look at the candidate that's in last place, which in this case was candidate C, and we say, you know, that candidate is in last place, they lost. But instead of those voters being, their votes being wasted or thrown away, like we would say today, those votes still count. And we look at those voters' second choices, and their votes count towards their second choice.
So it's interesting that you, so instant, what was it, instant
runoffs.
Yeah,
Yes.
That's right, because you wouldn't want to protract the process and say we've cut, you know, 5 down to 4, 4 down to 3, and finally we've got the finalists 3 down to 2.
People wouldn't show up to vote all these many different times if they had to.
So it's simply looking at the menu and saying, I
Exactly.
hope they have halibut, but if they don't, I bet the haddock is pretty good too. And
That's a nice exploit. Or, you know, if you ask a kid, what kind of ice cream do you want? And they say vanilla. And you say, well, if they don't have vanilla, what do you want? Chocolate. You know?
as opposed to somebody else choosing for them.
Exactly. Or really what happens, exactly. Or if they don't have vanilla, oh, you get no choice and you're going to get whatever everybody else likes.
But just to be sure that everybody understands, imagine a scenario where there's A, B, and C, and on the first run around, A gets 52%, B gets 46%, and let me do the math, 2%, 2% for the remaining candidate. What happens then?
In that case, the candidate with 52% wins.
So the threshold then is getting 50+%.
Correct.
So that some of those people may be zealously in favor of candidate A. Some may figure it's better than C, D, or E. This is somebody that I can live with in that regard.
Yeah, an unfair system would be one where if I, as a voter, had a candidate as my first choice, right, I would never want ranking someone second to hurt my first choice's chances of winning.
So they just tallied up the votes or something and gave 10 points for somebody who gets the first place vote or whatever. Right.
There are other alternative voting systems out there where you give points to your choices, but ranked choice voting is not that. Ranked choice voting, you only look at the first choices of all the candidates at first, and you only look at the second choices if a candidate does not have a majority of support.
Well, I think the idea of the runoff being instantaneous, because you're essentially, when you're picking second or third, fourth, is if your candidate doesn't make the cut, you're still in the game.
Exactly.
Your voice still gets heard.
That's the exact idea. Yeah. And there have been, so Maine started using ranked choice voting. They used it for the first time successfully in their 2018 elections, in their primaries and the general election. And there are a few examples of that. You know, in their Republican primary for governor, Sean Moody had 52.6% of the first choice votes in round 1. And so, election over. You don't look at, they didn't even look at any second choices of any voters.
It's interesting how that comes into play, and I think it's worth saying a little bit about the politics of this, and then we can think of some counterexamples where, in that instance, it put a Democrat in the House of Representatives for the final election.
That was the congressional district, U.S. House.
That's
correct.
The second district in Maine.
Correct.
And it is Jay Golden, am I close?
Jared Golden.
Jared Golden.
Yep.
So how did that work out? Nobody got to 50%, is that correct?
Sure. So yeah, I can talk about that race as well. So that race, one of the second, there are really three ways that a ranked choice voting election can turn out. Okay. So the first one is if a candidate has a majority of support in round one. Okay. And then election over, right? Just like I mentioned, Sean Moody did in the gubernatorial primary for the Republican Party in Maine. And in that case, the election result is, and the whole process is no different than the way we vote today.
Right.
Right. So the second case is really exemplified in the Democratic primary for the gubernatorial race in Maine. And in that race, there were 7 candidates in the race. Janet Mills, after the first round, after you looked at all the first choices, Janet Mills had 33% of the vote. And Adam, I think his name's Adam Coate, he had 28% of the vote. And there are various other candidates having other percentages. So since no candidate had a majority, the instant runoffs kick in. You start eliminating the candidate with the least votes and transferring the votes. And in the end, even though Janet Mills only looked like she had 33% support at first, when the second choices ended up coming in, we found that she had, I think it was 54% of the overall vote, and she ended up remaining the winner. So the ranked choice voting didn't actually change the outcome of the race from what our current system would elect.
If we go back to the presidential election in 2016, we know that the popular vote was Hillary Clinton's by 3 million plus or whatever, but the electoral vote didn't work out that way. And there was, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan were all very close. In those races, nobody won 50% of the vote. There was something on the order of, and I may be wrong by a percentage point or two, 5% went to independents. Gary Johnson, Libertarian, and Jill Stein for the Green Party.
Probably some to Vermin Supreme and other candidates too.
Probably, but that's down on the list. And so it's speculative in terms of where the Jill Green and Stein and where the Gary Johnson votes would have gone. But if there'd been ranked choice, it's conceivable that Trump's margin would have been bigger, or Hillary might have beaten. We'll just never know.
That's true.
In that instance. And if that's an instance where it might sound like a Democrat who's complaining, and I guess I am, we could also remember in New Hampshire that I believe she won by something in the order of 800 votes. And there were 30,000 votes for independents.
Who was it?
For Hillary Clinton won the
yeah.
state by 800 votes, which is whisker thin, but did not have a majority. And you went ranked choice, you'd have to look hard at where the second and third choices were of the people who voted for either Stein or for Johnson in that case. So it is a nonpartisan thing. I do think, and I wish I were wrong, frankly, that Democrats are more concerned about getting people out to vote and participating in the process. It would be great if we were joined by more people on the Republican side, but this is really a neutral process. It doesn't necessarily favor right or left, Democrat or Republican.
Right. It's very much a nonpartisan system. When I give presentations about this, I usually start with a couple of examples. One of them is the 2000 U.S. presidential election in Florida, where again we don't actually have second place vote data from that because we didn't use ranked choice voting, right? But a lot of people suspected that George W. Bush, he defeated Al Gore by 537 votes in that election. Ralph Nader had 97,000 votes in that election. A lot of people suspect that had they had ranked choice voting, Al Gore would have won that election, which would have then handed him the presidency.
Same thing happened. Actually, that's the dramatic example.
Yep.
But you go to the same election in 2000, and I think there was a 27,000 vote for Ralph Nader as well. And you can make your guesses as to whether they would have split for Bush or for Gore. Had Gore won New Hampshire, that would have been sufficient to put him in the White House.
And then, well, to get back to the nonpartisan issue, right? So that's an example of how it certainly would have helped the Democrats. And another example is in Congressional District 6, Salem, that whole area.
In Gloucester.
In Gloucester. There you go. I never know where CD3 and CD6 exactly ends, but in 2012, John Tierney ran against Richard Tisset. John Tierney, he had 48% of the vote. Richard Tisset had 47% of the vote, and there's a Libertarian candidate, Dan Fishman, with 5% of the vote. And a lot of people suspect that, had Fishman's voters had their second choice, they would have voted for Tisset, and he would have won the election, a Republican. So they're really
a little sermonizing here from my fellow Democrats. On this, we have to roll the dice, and sometimes it'll work out for us, sometimes it doesn't. But the overall goal of this, of promoting engagement, I think squares with our values, and if we can get more people out, I'll deal with whatever the result is.
Well, the big idea is that it would really help the population as a whole. That's the key. It's not a system that's going to help Democrats or help Republicans. It's going to help the party as a whole because, if you have two districts, one with a Democrat representative, but really the majority of people would have liked a Republican, and then another with a Republican, but a majority of people would have preferred a Democrat, don't you want those seats flipped, right? And that's what ranked choice voting in effect would give you.
Well, as I just want to reiterate the point, it means that a majority of people would have, in essence, cast a vote, either a first, second place vote for the person who's the incumbent, and that gives them some credibility to carry on. Now, I should know the number, but Nikki Zongas's old district had something when people were running, I think a dozen to succeed her. On the Democratic side, the ultimate winner of the primary had something in the order of 21% of the vote.
That's correct.
Now, she may be accomplished, she may do a wonderful job for the district, the Commonwealth, and the country, and so forth. But that means that 79% of the people favored someone else. Now, with ranked choice voting, she still might have prevailed, but have been prevailed because she was the first choice of many and a strong runner-up by many others.
That's correct. So I could get into details in that election if you'd like.
I'd be curious.
So sure. So Laurie Trahan was the winner, right? And she won with 21.6% of the vote. And Daniel Coe was the second place candidate. I think he had 21.5% of the vote. It was like 200 votes that separated them, right? And so a lot of people in that area brought up the same concern that you did. 79% of the people voted for someone else. Do we really know if Laurie Trahan was the best winner for that district or not? And, people don't necessarily insist that she was not or was, but it's really, we just don't know. And it's interesting to note that Laurie Trahan is actually a big supporter of ranked choice voting.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's really a logical idea too. So a lot of people think like, oh, she won with the system. Why would she want to change a system that elected her that she benefited from? But now she has to try to, govern and represent, or not govern, but represent this area where she only had 21% vote. She doesn't feel like she has that mandate.
Right.
Where under ranked choice voting, she actually wishes they had ranked choice voting, because if so, she would have eventually been able to prove that she has that majority mandate. And she's given us a wonderful quote supporting that, and she's reached out to local state representatives and senators to actually urge them to also support ranked choice voting.
What other endorsements have you gotten?
Oh man, we have so many. In terms of politicians, from the federal level, I mean, Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, John McCain have all endorsed ranked choice voting at some points. Bill Weld, just the other day, had a great endorsement of ranked choice voting. For our state, Seth Moulton, Laurie Trahan.
And newspapers?
Newspapers, the Boston Globe has endorsed us locally, a few others. The Boston Globe is the only one I can say with confidence has in our area, but also nationally, the New York Times, the Economist, the Atlantic have written glowing pieces about ranked choice voting.
So you described getting into this 3 years ago where maybe 1% of the people knew about this. We've increased the margin a little bit. This will air a number of times in June. I hope people are intrigued and enthused by this. But what accounts for the success of building some groundswell for this?
I would say really the energy of people in Massachusetts to want to bring ranked choice voting has accounted for that success. We're a grassroots organization. Voter Choice Massachusetts, that's the organization to bring ranked choice voting to Mass.
One more time?
Voter Choice Massachusetts. Yeah, the website is voterchoicema.org. And so, yeah, and we've just had a lot of grassroots energy of volunteers who want to make this happen. I've been a volunteer with Voter Choice for the last, since November 2016 when we first started. And I go to Democratic town committees and city committees, Republican town committees and city committees, and give talks to them to educate them about what ranked choice voting, what kind of benefits it would bring. I go to people's houses. People welcome us into their houses to give this little presentation, and we do mock elections actually. We rank things like pizzas, ice creams, beers, and determine winners.
Well, if you think of it, there's a national obsession with lists, best movies of all time, greatest baseball player of all time, whatever the case may be. So why don't we do it with political candidates? You had mentioned Fall River, and that's not a story I know well. There's something that happened there that is relevant to what we're talking about?
Yeah, sure. So in 2019, just a few months ago, Fall River, they had a mayor, Jaziel Carrera, who there were some, I don't exactly recall there were issues with him as mayor, and a bunch of citizens were trying to overturn him, or basically oust him as mayor, recall him as mayor. And so they actually had an election to recall him as mayor. Now, in that election, it was like a referendum question. And that referendum question was going to appear on the same ballot as the next mayoral election. Now, what's interesting is they had a weird thing in their rules that Carrera and his lawyers figured out, which is that there was nothing prohibiting him from still entering in the next mayoral race. So in the recall election, I got the numbers here, 61.5% of Fall River residents voted to recall Correa as mayor.
Right.
38.5% of them said for him to keep as mayor. So they effectively ousted him as mayor in that recall ballot. But there were several candidates in the race for mayor, I believe 7, Correa being one of them. Correa, you can imagine, if 61.5% of the people voted to oust him, they obviously didn't support him, right?
Right. So
it turns out he got 34.5% of the vote. But since there were so many candidates in the race, all the other candidates had less than 34% of the vote. So Correa, in the same election, was ousted as mayor and then reinstated as mayor in the same second.
Oh my goodness. I knew about, and I gathered there were some scandals about self-dealing and money, something of that sort. And
I don't know all the details.
I know, well, you don't want to go on a limb of it, but it was that sort of thing as I recall. And we're a long way from Fall River, so I could well have that wrong. This would not be entirely new in Massachusetts. I almost hesitate to cite the example, but Cambridge has had this for their city council elections for a long time. Am I correct?
So, somewhat correct.
Okay.
So, ranked choice, there are two, I guess you could say there are two different types of elections in politics. There are elections where you just elect one candidate for a position, and there are things like city councils and whatnot where you elect multiple seats in an election.
As we have here in Gloucester.
Correct. So there is a ranked choice voting for single winner elections, and there is a form of ranked choice voting for multi-winner elections. So first of all, Cambridge uses the multi-winner version for their 9-member city council.
Got it.
Voter Choice is strictly only advocating for single winner elections right now.
Okay. So in any event, Cambridge has that because I assume they got some home rule approval from the state legislature. They just went ahead and did it?
Well, they've been using it since, I want to say, the 1940s.
Okay.
So I don't know the history of its enactment back then, but they've been using it for a very long time.
But if Gloucester said, with, we hope, strong support, let's do that in Gloucester for our primaries, for state and federal, and for other elections as well, they have to go to the legislature to get a home rule petition. What you're looking for is something that would grant blanket permission to anybody in Massachusetts holding an election to use this if they chose to. Is that correct?
So partially, yeah. So Voter Choice Massachusetts is working on really what's called so we have 2 bills in the state legislature right now. One of them is our flagship bill, and that is ranked choice voting for all single winner elections for state and federal, except
mandated or optional?
mandated.
Mandated.
Yep.
I'm okay with that.
So am I. Except for U.S. president, because there are U.S. constitutional issues with the Electoral College.
Yeah.
But for U.S. Senate, all the U.S. House districts, all the state representative, all the state Senate districts, governor, and a few, lesser popular races, we would use ranked choice voting to elect those single winner seats. So that's our first bill. That's our flagship bill that we're really focused on pushing for. It's basically what Maine uses. So we have a second bill, which is called our local option bill. And that would allow municipalities to use ranked choice voting in their municipal elections.
I see.
Without having to file a home rule petition through the State House.
Okay. So these are separate bills.
Correct.
You're behind them both, but
Correct.
the primary one is the first one
Correct.
on that.
Yep.
Well, I'm glad to get the correct. A couple of times you said, well, that's partially true. So I said at the outset I was going to learn more. I have learned some more on this. Where does it stand now, Billy?
Sure. You mean in terms of legislative movement
so
or
obviously
energy?
Yeah. No, so the energy appears to be there.
Yep.
I hope you're ambitious on getting this through soon. Who needs to be won over, and how are you going to do it?
Sure. So right now, our main action is to, try to work with the state legislature to see if they will, enact ranked choice voting as the way we conduct elections. And we're having moderate success with that so far. We are meeting with all of the state legislators, reps and senators, one-on-one to try to make sure we educate and inform them about what ranked choice voting is and isn't, and allow them to ask any questions that they have about it. Because we're the regional authorities on ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
And so far we've done that, and we are up to 89 out of the 200 state legislators who have, came out in public support of ranked choice voting. And I can say many others, when I meet with them. I've met with probably about 20 of them or so myself. And a lot of them say, I like it. It sounds good. It's new, it's a little scary. I don't know what voters will think about it. I don't want to put my name on it just yet, but I like it. So 89 have publicly said, put my name on your website. I am a supporter, I'm with it. People like Pete Capano from Lynn just said that recently. And then, some state legislators who, even if they're not one of those 89, a lot of them still like it. But, we know the bill passage process at the State House is a very long and complicated one. There are over 7,000 bills in the state legislature last session, and I think only 400 of them ended up being voted on or something like that, I heard. So, so we're trying to work through the state legislature. That's our first part of this plan.
Well, there's an old saying that the first rule in politics is to know how to count, and it looks like you're doing it.
Yep.
Thank you so much for joining us, Billy. This has been edifying for me, and I hope for our audiences as well.
Cool. Can I talk about the second stage as well?
I think we're
done?
used our time
right.
on the countdown clock.
Okay.
But thanks once again, and we hope to see you again soon.
All right. Pleasure. Thanks a lot.